Good evening. This is the Tri-Town meeting on Wednesday, March 4th, 2015. I'm Larry Delaney of the Bolton Selectmen. As is our custom at these Tri-Town meetings, because we have a changing attendance, why don't we go around and introduce ourselves in sort of a clockwise direction?
I'm Don Lowe, the Bolton Town Administrator.
Stan Wysocki, Bolton Selectman.
Mark Sprague, Bolton Selectman.
Ryan McNutt, Lancaster Town Administrator.
Don Hawks, Stowe Selectman.
Jennifer Leone, Lancaster Selectman.
Nancy Fettersfield, School Committee Rep for Bolton.
Tom Ryan, Stowe Selectman.
Joe Myerson, Bolton Advisory Committee.
Sue Thompson, Lancaster FinCom.
George King, Assistant Superintendent, Michelle Region.
Michael Wood, Superintendent, Michelle Region.
Stasha Downey, Advisory, Bolton.
Lorraine Moscow, School Committee, Bolton.
Ted Kirshner, Bolton Advisory.
Brad Cody, Bolton Advisory.
Randy Bindu,
Citizen?
Citizen, Great Town, Bolton.
Peter McNabb, Stowe Finance Committee. Byron,
All right, thank you. The first item on our agenda is FY16 Neshoba Regional School District budget.
Larry, I'm sorry, George is under a bit of a time constraint tonight. Can we do the last item on the agenda first? Would that be hard to do out of order?
No, sure.
Thank you.
I think our last item is the discussion of the white paper, which was something that was posted at the Neshoba website. Who wants to start that discussion off?
I asked.
Don?
Yeah, thank you. I asked that it be put on the agenda, just because I think it probably is going to have to take more discussion than we have time for tonight, if Mr. King's on it. Because I'm assuming you are the author of that, even though your name wasn't on it. Okay, but it wasn't dated or signed, but I just wanted to make sure that I was attributing it correctly. I think there are a number of disputed statements in this document, and I'll just give my general overview of it in a very simplistic manner. As I read this, the implication is that because the towns have purported to have increased revenues in the form of stabilization and free cash, and they have unused levy capacity, that therefore that comprises affordability to meet the school budget as it was submitted. And I think we can get into a discussion of some of these things, but the analogy for me is if I have an income of $50,000 at $300,000 in credit cards, it doesn't mean I can afford a yacht for $150,000 just because the buying power is there, because I won't be able to sustain it next year. And I think that's what we're looking at here. Second thing I would like to, whenever we're talking about budgets, it is always the budget number. I think more appropriate for us as municipal officials is to look at the assessment numbers. Because while the budget, as I heard it at the budget workshop, was 5.017% increase the budget, that translates for Stowe into 7.47% increased assessment, and I think the other two towns are similarly above the 5.0%. So I guess perhaps maybe just ask Mr. King, while we have him available here, how we can justify some of these statements, particularly one conflicting one. You're suggesting that we use resources which are stored assets, but in the beginning of your document, you defend not using any more of your own for the very same reason that I just stated, that it's one-time money. You can't build it into the operating budget and come back and use it again next year. So, could you explicate a little bit and maybe throw some light on that?
Yeah, well, thank you first for going through it. I think that the purpose here was not at all to suggest that the town spend stored assets or anything like that. What the purpose was, for a number of years now, we've had discussions about finances and the budget eventually gets resolved. So what we wanted to do, at least what I wanted to do, to try to put it in some perspective, and I'm sorry, just back up a little bit. During those discussions, we always hear about the difficult financial times we're all in. I guess that's a regular condition of municipal government in Massachusetts. So over those times, the school district has kept the budget low over a 5-year period. And I think the only thing that was trying to be pointed out was over that 5-year period when the budget increases were low, the towns had the opportunity to increase their financial flexibility. I'm not suggesting in any way, nor I don't think anyone in the district is suggesting in any way how you spend that money. But we're simply putting it out, because it is a fact. If you look at the state, they have a financial flexibility report available on our website. And it talks about those key elements: stabilization, free cash, excess capacity. The other thing I thought was important to do, because there's been a discussion among many finance committee selectmen over recent years, is just talk a little bit how we do spend reserves, or don't, as you say, in some instances spend reserves, which you're right. I do not advocate spending all our reserves. I think we spend a reasonable amount of our reserves, and I think that's the second thing we were trying to point out. So, certainly wasn't looking to offend anyone's sensibilities or in any way make suggestions of how people spend their money. It was simply an attempt to talk about how the school district has managed its budget over the last 5 or 6 years during difficult financial times since the 2008 crisis. It was to point out the school department does in fact and has in fact been responsive and look for ways to spend stored assets, as you would call them, including the statutory reserve fund that we had up to 2012, 2013. And not so much to support the budget per se as proposed, just to talk about the fact that, this particular year the budget is higher, and the first time it has been higher at this level for 8 years. But there's reasons for it. We talked about those reasons for it. I think a lot of those are out of our control. So that's really what the intent was. It certainly wasn't offending anybody's sensibilities. I don't think it's factually wrong. I just think it's a fair discussion of how people choose to make policy decisions, and I certainly understand that. I'm not, as I say, suggesting anything specific in terms of that. I'm just trying to lay it out.
I'll just make one other comment and then pass it along. Quoting from the report, it says something about minimal assessments, your characterization, in increases resulted in higher stabilization funds, while taxes were not maximized during that period. Maximized, to me, looks at taxing up to the 2.5 limit. That's what max is for us. I don't think anyone is suggesting we do that. If we did it in Stowe, everyone's tax bill in town, average tax bill would go up $1,300 on top of what it is already. And as far as assessment, again, let's talk assessments rather than budgets, because that's what we pay. We don't pay your budget, we pay an assessment based on the budget. Lancaster, since 2000, fiscal 10 to 15, Lancaster's assessment increased 10.8%, Bolton's increased 14.2%, and Stowe's increased 15%. So it's not inconsequential. And our total support for education, if you add the proposed budget plus the debt service that we're carrying now, which is substantial for Hale School and Center School, if all of that were approved this year, we would be appropriating $17,437,000 for education. That's 66% of our total budget. Looked at another way, the increase that we're, an assessment is 1.1 something million as it stands on the budget today, as I understand it. That is more than the total growth in our new growth, which we can assess taxes on under 2.5, plus any increases in free cash. I mean, using up all of the new money before we fund any of our other budget elements. So with that, thank you.
Do we?
I just wanted to point out that if we had over the last, I mean, we've taxed up to our levy limit many years in a row. We had no choice. And we've made a concerted effort to try to help bring that down, but if we continued to tax to our levy limit, we would be about at 24. So our ability to tax would be maxed out next year. And then we're done. I mean, we have nothing. There's no, without new growth, we would have nothing. So I know our FinCom has been working diligently with our finance director to help alleviate some of the tax burden to the town's people, but also give us some leeway in, if we have another year like '09, if we have something that happens that we can't account for, we at least still have the 2.5 levy limit that we could max out if we needed to. But I think, 09, 10, 11, we did max it out, much to people's dismay. So.
Jennifer's reference to $25, in case anyone in here isn't aware of it, legally, no town is allowed to tax higher than $25 a thousand. That is the cap, regardless of 2.5 levy limits. So if Lancaster or any town gets to the $24 stage, you're absolutely 1 year away from not being able to carry over expenses year over year of any sort of increase. And just to support what Jennifer said, in Bolton, we taxed to the levy limit for many, many years in a row. And it was just recently, in the past 2, possibly 3 years, but I think it was 2, that we didn't. And that's a positive thing. That's not a negative thing. It is a positive thing to tax people what you need to tax them for and nothing more, and not run up their tax bills. And as I said at our advisory committee meeting last week, we're currently at a $517,000 plus deficit. And fortunately, we have some free cash to deal with that next year. But this type of growth, for whatever reason, is not affordable and not sustainable. And we need to be working together to try to bring this down. And 2.5 overrides shouldn't even be part of the discussion, in my opinion.
Right?
I'd like to, I share both the statements that Jennifer and Dawn said. I'd like to expand upon what Jennifer was saying. Lancaster hasn't used its entire levy limit in the past couple of years, and that's been a benefit to the residents of Lancaster in a very meaningful way. We have 84 parcels in tax title. There's 300 additional parcels that will be added later this year. Of those parcels, 101 of them have houses on them. These are folks that may actually lose their homes if we taxed them to the full amount that we were authorized to do so. So keeping this levy limit, A, helps us not reach municipal debt, because $25 per 1,000 means every single conversation is cutting services and laying people off, including myself. Nobody is sacred at that point. So it's not just also keeping the town from $25 per 1,000. It's, in a sense, keeping struggling families in their homes. Furthermore, we right now, just putting together our draft budget, are almost $670,000 in a deficit. And I have about $600,000 in capital items that are not even included yet. These are necessary items, right? The schools were able to give their capital list for the Mary Rowlandson School and the Luther Burbank School. It's fixing doors, it's repaving things, sidewalks, this and that. Towns have those same expenses, but yet we would take care of the schools before we would do our own. We have many, many capital items that have been deferred for a long time that the town finally needs to stop kicking that can down the road. I need the resources to be able to fix the things that are broken in the town. The second part is, I've had many meetings with Mr. King and Mr. Wood, and I appreciate, the dialogue that we've been able to have so far. And they pointed out that expanding the tax base in economic development is something that will alleviate these annual discussions. And I agree with them. I see it as my responsibility to expand the tax base in Lancaster, and I see many opportunities to do so over the next 2 years. That also requires that I have some resources to be able to undertake that. Sometimes making money requires spending money. Certain grants have matching requirements. Certain infrastructure projects require the town cover the pre-design funds ahead of being able to apply for the grant funds. And those costs can be substantial, $50,000, $100,000. So where we can meet with the school and try to achieve some level of, consideration for each other's responsibilities in our budget, again, the more this becomes unsustainable, we're both in the same boat. So, I just wanted to have those concerns put into the record.
I think I share my colleagues', comments and sentiments. I think while we have said over the last few years that the budget in general has been becoming a problem, both, trying to manage the town's budget as well as the majority of the budget that goes to the schools. I think we definitely have reached the point of, if we continue, this is unsustainable. And I think this is a shared problem, and I think both sides need to approach this and look at it from a number of perspectives and try to be creative, because we cannot continue down this path. I mean, Don shared at the advisory committee meeting last week when Mr. King came in, some projections, and you can elaborate when I'm done, but if this continues, the amount of assessment increase that's going to be coming to Bolton, we just can't deal with this. So I think we have, as many towns are, we're facing the same set of problems and issues, and I think it's a shared problem, and I think we need to come up with shared solutions to figure out how we can best move this forward, because it's just, I think we have definitely reached the turning point at this particular point in time.
Mr. Lindsay?
Dave Lindsay, Berlin Road. I'd like to argue against this concept that because we're below the levy limit, we're somehow not taxing ourselves enough. When Bolton taxed at the levy limit, we were in the top 1% of tax rates everywhere in the state. We're now taxing about $500,000 below the levy limit, and we're not luxuriating in real low taxes. We're the top 2% of tax rates in the whole state. So we are taxing the heck out of ourselves, more than almost any other town. Only 6 other towns in the whole state tax themselves as much as Bolton. So the fact that we're below the levy limit is no indication that we aren't taxing the heck out of ourselves. Second, the reason we have a fair amount of free cash is because we are taxing the heck out of ourselves. And I have been harping against large free cash totals for years now, and I hope the Selectmen and Advisory Committee of Bolton will take a lesson from this. When you flash $1 million of free cash out there, you attract spenders. And we have got to stop doing that. And I think what we need to do is target 0 free cash at the end of our budgeting process, because we always raise a fair amount and we'll still have enough to operate with without that. So I hope this year we will go for a much lower free cash target and stop encouraging people who want to spend it.
Well, Mr. Lindsay, it's very difficult to go from a free cash limit of $250,000 to 0, and it's going to make a huge difference. And once again, I will continue to disagree with you that the tax rate number is a manufactured number. And there have been a number of articles in the Boston Globe which have shown that communities that have much lower tax rates than Bolton are taxing their citizens at a much higher rate due to valuations and the like. So a high tax rate doesn't necessarily mean that we're taxing the heck out of our citizens.
Well, I think we are taxing the heck out of them.
You're welcome to your opinion.
You're welcome to your opinion, and you've been on an advisory committee for 7 years and a selectman for 3, and you should know better. So no, we're not taxing the heck out of our citizens.
I think
and you know that every year we go through the budget and scrub it scrupulously. And as a matter of fact, you were at the advisory committee meeting last week when we were looking at a budget that had a value of $100 a line item, and we reduced it to 10. So we are going very, very meticulously through the budget to make sure that we're not necessarily overtaxing or overspending or providing budgets that are overly generous. And you should know that.
My argument is on the tax collection side, not the spending side. In other words, we tax more than we spend. I don't think we should do that.
Randy?
Yeah, so I've said this before, and I'd like to say it again. I've looked at the numbers for a long time, and I want to turn attention back to the school budget for a second. When we talk about the E&D and utilization of the E&D, it is exactly the same as the point that David was trying to make on free cash for the town of Bolton. When you guys have a $2 million E&D, and every year you pat yourself on the back that you are utilizing $1 million in the budget of the E&D fund, what that essentially says is we are comfortable if we had $1 million E&D, because we have a $2 million E&D and we're going to apply $1 million to the budget, and when we have $1 million left, that's going to be an adequate enough number for us. What has happened over the past number of years is you've applied $1 million to the budget, and $1 million has come back at the end of the year, which basically means that you never spent that $1 million. It was implied that you were going to spend it, but something else happened in the process, whether it be you didn't spend the expenses that you budgeted or you had more revenue than you budgeted, something replenished that $1 million, okay? The town of Bolton has the same issue, David. You know, I don't agree with all of David's comments, but the math works, and to Stan's point, we believe at the town that we absolutely want a minimum free cash target of about $500,000. And in order to do that, we have levered our free cash targets in budget cycles down to as low as $250,000, which in the past couple of budget cycles has yielded free cash balances of $1 million. We haven't always gotten it right, but we are actively lowering in some cases our target because history proves that we will replenish more and we'll get what we ultimately want. I challenge the school to do the same thing. If $1 million is your target, which has been apparent over the past few years because you've utilized $1 million in the budget and kept $1 million aside, the mechanism isn't working right. I would challenge you to have a target of $500,000 or a zero, and that would get you the $1 million based on your track record. George, you mentioned this in your article or your white paper, and basically said that that was utilizing E&D as a one-time, sort of windfall. And I get the math, but a one-time item is better than a no-time item.
Well,
Yeah, no, George, could you first explain how does the E&D get replenished? I mean, town, we know about, it's analogous to free cash, but the revenue sources don't really change for E&D, do they?
No, they do. So how it gets replenished is essentially the way it does in the town. It's either excess revenue or lack of expenditures. And if we've been through the 4 or 5 years where we have, as you stated, got back to $30 million, there are different reasons that happened each year that are somewhat unpredictable to us. If you look at the reasons are, you can see that we wouldn't have known that when we did the budget in March of the previous year. Once in August, we negotiated a change in employee health insurance to save us hundreds of thousands of dollars. Another time, we got a relatively substantial revenue change, it was either Chapter 70 or regional school transportation, I don't remember which one, I have to look it up. So there were large sources of revenue that came in that we weren't anticipating. Other revenues are just smaller, but sometimes still go into 6 figures. Things like our Medicare reimbursement and stuff are completely unpredictable, both in terms of how much we get back and when it's going to come in. So revenue surpluses have been part of it, and major expense changes have been another part of it. I agree with Randy to a certain extent. I think it's reasonable to think that, I would hope it's reasonable to think that each year we would have somewhere around the $500,000 range. That's 1% of a $50 million budget. I don't think there's a margin we'd want to operate on much closer than that. We don't build that in there, it just happens most of the time. Things like who we hire, people out for long-term leaves. Sometimes those cost us money, sometimes they'll save us money, depending how much leave time they have, that type of thing. Those things add up. The $50 million budget, they add up to $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, and then you add a revenue change or an expense change you weren't expecting, it can easily get back to $1 million. So I think that's why that figure, for the most part, has been targeted, because I think it puts us in a reasonable situation. Again, many of you have been around here a lot longer than I. You don't want to get back to where you were told 15 years ago, where people are spending money they don't have, okay? So I think, what I tried to point out in the paper is E&D is our only resource, so to speak, of a long-term equity resource. So therefore, if we miss that target, and we miss it big, we can come up, just like you can end up in a situation where you target too low, where you end up with a certified free cash deficit. And I've been in towns before where we ended up with a certified free cash deficit, okay? That could easily happen. If we have an E&D deficit, that's not a good situation to be in, and we can very easily, be back to you guys with more. So I think you have to, and that's really, as I say, being the only reserve we have, it also has impacts outside the budget. It has impacts on our cash flow. There'd be expenses for us to, to borrow short-term revenue in some instances if we didn't have, some level of cash flow on our books. So,
But your level is pretty high, and in fact, I just pulled off the DOR of the 80-odd regional school districts. You have more free cash than anybody, I mean, more E&D than any of those districts.
so we stated it. I mean, there's no question, I don't know, you mean a percentage of dollars? Because we have.
I'm looking at just at absolute dollars. I think no one's.
We're near the top, that's for sure. And
Yeah.
I think that's a good thing, and that's a policy discussion we can have in a long period of time. So you have to remember again, we're limited to how much we can have. We're limited to 5% of our budget. So it's not like free cash, which theoretically, I understand there's some difference about this, but I'm talking the legal aspect of it. You can have as much free cash as you choose to on a policy basis. No one says after 5% of your budget, you have to give it back to the taxpayers. Okay? If we go past the 5% limit, it goes back to
the
towns on the assessment. But it goes back either way, that's the argument. So it doesn't, it's not like we're not giving it back. We're giving it back, as Randy says, as part of the budget each year. And, otherwise, if we didn't have that, that would be on the assessment. So, I think we've hit a good equilibrium point, but it's not a guarantee. And I don't know, and I don't want to be wrong about this, but some of the things that you see driving next year's budget, the things that I understand everybody's frustration with the budget and the cost and, all those types of things you're saying. But it's not like this budget that we're proposing. And I'm not saying it's not going to change. Michael has been asked by the school committee, we'll be making recommendations to the school committee next week. And they'll be able to see, not recommendations, but scenarios. They'll be able to see what changes could be made and at what cost to possibly lower it, okay? But it's not like this budget is something where we've come out this year and said, we're going to have a big budget increase this year. We haven't had one for a number of years. We're going to do all these new things. It's essentially being driven by our ongoing cost and a significant special ed cost that is out of our control. Those significant special ed costs didn't just grow out of nowhere, okay? They grew in this fiscal year for various reasons. That very factor is going to likely impact that recertification of CED this year, okay? Because the things that, for two of these things I talked about to Larry's question, aren't happening this year. The opposite is happening. We're having unexpected costs. We all have the issue of unexpected, roof shoveling and snow plowing and all that type of thing. And
snow and ice deficits for all the towns.
Absolutely, I said we all have it, I understand that, there's no question, it's frustrating as hell, but, we all have it. But it's, so those things this year, for the first time in a few years, aren't breaking our way, and that's reflected both in the budget and ultimately in our E&D certification. Again, years not over, I don't know, and, we had originally had a regional transportation increase that the governor cut. Had we got that, that might have offset that, okay? Maybe we would have came back. But without that, that's one of those revenue things we weren't expecting. Thank God we didn't use it because it got cut. So, it is a big number, but I think there's an equilibrium there that's fair to everybody. And I would think, maybe I'm wrong, and it's certainly open to discussion, it's in the interest of the towns to have us to be, at least solvent.
I also just add that it keeps the towns, it protects the towns from the school district having to come back to you in June for additional assessments to cover most of the, in reference to the special ed costs. You read in the paper all the time that when they do their final accounting, do it for transportation, for other district placements or other costs, municipal school systems have to come back to the towns and ask for more money. And I think it's a struggle. We have not had to do that because of the philosophy we've taken. And I think that's a protection for the town, to make sure that you're not hit with an unplanned bill that you're not ready for.
Thank you, George and Michael. So going on this line of thought, I have this analysis that I think many other folks here might have, because it was emailed around, about your E&D. And in 2004, your certified E&D was $840,000. Since 2004, that's grown to, in 2014, $2.2 million.
I don't have that.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. But it has grown to 2.2 million. Your excess, your 5% excess would be 2.5 million. So you're hovering right at your excess where you would have to return it to the town, right? The language is under 2.5 you may, and over 2.5 you shall.
Yeah.
So the idea that you would somehow, the schools would be undercapitalized and, a unanticipated assessment during the year could wipe you out. You could draw this down to $500,000, and looking at just the history of this since 2004, you could keep $500,000 in there, and it would be an outlier type of thing to happen to you in the middle of the year, to wipe out $500,000 in your bank account. But yet you could cover, you could track and anticipate, let's stay status quo on the SPED thing, right? The SPED costs are because, newer students have come in with, greater needs and they cost more per student. And you own those students until they graduate or their situation changes, right? Maybe their costs get lowered from a different program or something. But you can track, how long you're going to have those students for and how long you're going to incur such additional costs from those students, right? And when those students are going to chapter out of your school system. Now, assuming, just for hypothetical sake, you don't incur new SPED students with great needs like that, you would be able to anticipate drawing down from this E&D to cover those excess costs and not pass that on to the town.
This is an argument, so to speak, that we can continue to have. I understand what you're saying, okay? The philosophy has been to try to make this district a little bit more solid than it was 15 years ago, okay? By doing so, one strategy to do that has been the E&D, to build up our E&D certification, towards the limit, okay? That's, I think that's good findings. But the way we've managed it, I don't think hurts anybody. That's the point that we're trying to make. If we were sitting on 2.5 million and spending zero of it each year, so we're just gonna keep this nest egg here and make sure we guarantee ourselves, we feel better with it here, okay? I can understand your point a little bit easier. Now, we're spending it every year, half of it, as Randy said, and pretty much keeping us at a level of the equilibrium. There's no question, if we wanted to, if the school committee approved, we could spend $1.5 million in free cash this year in our budget. We could give everybody a break and say, we're going to spend $1.5 million in E&D this year in our budget. Okay, we can do that. And everybody would get about $133,000, $150,000, $167,000 off their assessment. Okay, but next year, that's going to have a major impact on your assessment. So if everybody thinks that's a good idea, and they'd rather take the bonus this year and take the extra assessment next year, then maybe everybody should indicate that, and maybe that's something the school committee can consider. But as good as it sounds this year, it's going to hurt you next year. Because if we use 1.5 million this year, there's no way we're going to certify back at the number of 2 million. Okay, combination of our experience this year and the fact we used a lot more. Okay? So you agree with that? I
would never agree that you'd replenish it at $1 million.
Okay, right, exactly. Right, okay, we'd probably be in $1 million, maybe $1 million, 2 or 3. Right. Okay. If that was the case, there's no way next year we could spend $1 million in E&D. We only could probably spend 800,000, say max. Okay, that would leave us 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 left. Okay. So if our revenue and our budget, status quo, even if we had a zero increased budget, which is probably not going to happen, okay, that would be $700,000 more next year in revenue that would have to go to the assessment. So in other words, if we did that and we couldn't keep that equilibrium, and those hypothetical numbers we just discussed work, your assessments would go up $700,000 next year on a 0% budget, which we all know is not going to happen. That's why we don't do it. We try to keep it through a double thing, keeping the assessments more predictable and the district more solvent. To us, it makes sense. It's good financial policy. If the member towns really think it's poorly thought out, then maybe we should put together a blue ribbon commission or something and talk about it. But I think it makes sense as to why we've done it. And I just don't see the advantage to doing it the other way.
I mean, I understand what you're saying about, I'm sorry, was there something?
No, yeah, no, that's fine.
I mean, you're keeping this argument with a lot of hypotheticals, that if you we're left with 1 million, say you spent the 1.5 million this year and you only had 500,000 left.
Yeah.
You're going to get additional revenue into this E&D next year. It might not be 1 million, maybe at 800,000. So now you have 500,000 plus 800,000.
Yeah, that's what you just said.
Right, okay.
Yeah. And you spend 800,000 of that next year. We're still a $700,000 deficit.
But you don't know exactly what, and you're saying that this year the increased costs are because you got additional sped obligations.
Right.
And those are going to reoccur for a while, for a couple of years, right? Because they're tracking along with students.
Sure, right.
But you don't know necessarily that you're going to get something equivalent next year on top of that.
No, I don't.
It could end up, next year you have a really good year.
Right, that's what I just gave you.
But we know we're having a bad year this year.
But that's what I just gave you, Ryan. I said on a 0% budget, which would be a very good year. Okay?
Sure. But I'm asking for the devil that I know versus the devil I
Right, but what I'm saying
don't.
is, even if we have that good year you talk about, and we have a 0% budget increase, the way the revenue stream is built, if we built it the way we just discussed, that's a $700,000 assessment increase unless we get Chapter 70 or something like that, assuming other sources don't come in, which we know they're not going to come into that level. Most of that $700,000 is going to be transferred to the towns. That's before we go for any increase whatsoever. Whereas we've avoided that by not having wide ranges in our spending at E&D. I can't sit here and guarantee you there's not going to be E&D deficit of sorts in our revenue next year anyway, because of some of the experiences we're having. But if we go spend 1.5 billion, I can virtually guarantee you there's going to be a substantial deficit even at a 0% increase. It can't be avoided, it's just math. You only can spend the money once.
Mr. Lindsay?
Yeah, this year we're having something like a $2.5 million assessment increase, right? And you're talking about how horrible a 700,000 increase would be. I think it might make some sense to lower this one to $1.5 million or something from $2.5 million, and then maybe next year it'll be $1.5 million too.
700,000 is the 0.
Okay, but still, I think that goes back to the devil we know rather than the devil that's lurking out there. I also want to comment on Michael's statement that running this big E&D surplus protects the towns. I would much rather you were running your budget really, really tightly, and at the end you did have to come back to us for maybe $35,000 a town to even things out, because then we'd be paying for exactly what we get. Now we're paying for way more than we get, and the risk of some slippage and the encouragement of additional spending, it's much better to be tight. And as to George's point on that 15 years ago we got in trouble. We didn't get in trouble because we ran the budget too tight. We got in trouble because of fraud. The guy running it was cooking the books and being dishonest about it. That's a whole different kettle of fish. If we had known what was really going on, we would have made it right. So unless you're positing some likelihood of somebody cooking the books the way they did 15 years ago, I just don't think that argument holds water. I think we should pay just for what we need.
Brad?
Yeah, so, I mean, what I'm hearing is, this, just a turn of events and all or nothing, and maybe it's not going, down to 500,000, but maybe it's an adjustment and see where it goes. And And I would agree to some extent, because I've heard enough of the argument every Tuesday night from Mr. Lindsay. But what I would say is, I would agree in the sense that if there is that excess large emergency fund, that it offers some comfort, and likely there's the potential for more freedom to spend. And I would argue that if that wasn't necessarily the case, there might be a little bit greater tightness on the spend. And I recognize, and with all due respect, there's no point in mentioning a 0%, because we know that 80% of your budget is tied to salary, and there's just automatic built-in, so we know it's gonna go up every year.
I agree, that's why I said it's hypothetical.
Yeah, all right. So what I would say is, looking in that big area of the 80% that drives everything, and I recognize that you guys have gone out and looked to be creative on healthcare, but are there other avenues that you can entertain on that front, given that is the biggest nut inside that budget?
And we're always looking for ideas.
Question for you regarding your presentation to the school committee next week. It's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong here, that you're going to present possibly tiers of reduction. Is that right? Do any of your tiers of reduction include or present options that are at a kind of a higher level budgeting, such as the reduction of this E&D account, or are they more, we're going to cut this service or this new hire or this new initiative? Is there any options for the school committee to consider above and beyond cutting what is in the current budget for services to our kids?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I think I pretty much agree with what everybody's been saying here. One of the things is, many years ago when we were talking about fraud, well, it was fraud because they were spending money they didn't have, because they wanted to spend money on certain things. Granted, it was all for the kids and everything, but essentially they spent money they didn't have. We're all rapidly approaching the point where we're not going to have any money to spend. If we bump up against the levy limit of $25, we've got a problem. We talked about this years ago. We ended up all paying for it over the years when we had to have the deficit fund. Now that that's been retired, but even that got sucked into the budget and spent. And, I think some of that's been what's been being used rather than raising the budget anymore. We had $600,000 that they're not having to pay out, so guess what? But it's money that was never really part of their budget. It was supposed to pay off, problems. What we can't do is we can't just keep spending more and more and more. And whether it's, I don't necessarily disagree with the school district as far as keeping a reasonable buffer, somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million, that they're constantly rolling. I think they do need to have some cushion. Could be a little bit less than it is, but at the same time, that would only be 1 year money if they drew that down, and it's got to be on the spending side. That the spending side has got to come down below the 5% limit. It's either that, or we'll be having the same conversation next year, and then, oh, wait a minute, there is no E&D money to spend, and then the year after that, we're all going to be bumping up against levy limits, unless the spending comes down. So it really, I'm sympathetic to the school district, and, I think they've been doing a great job. My kids went through there, but there's got to be a little bit more control. You can't go from, a 1 or 2% increase to a 5% increase 1 year. I think, maybe we could handle a 2 or 3% increase on a regular basis with the, associated, knowing we're going to be paying more in assessments than the 2 or 3%. But, with Stowe seeing a 7.5% increase this year, it's like, who are you kidding? You know, we're talking about, you know, we just went through and we're building a new fire station community center to replace something that was, you know, 50 years old. We're reusing a building the school district didn't want, but guess what? It happens to be in great shape. And you know what? The payment we're gonna be making on that, we're looking at that kind of increase every year. If we see this kind of increase. So I really think it's gotta come down to maybe a combination of cutting the budget, spending a little bit more of the E&D, but at the same time, I think the school district does need to keep a fairly reasonable E&D account, and something around 1% of their budget. You know, they're probably spending $100,000 for snow removal extra this year. You know, we'll be spending probably damn close to that, you know, just for ourselves on, you know, out of our.
Four times that.
Well, that's somebody does your snow removal.
Yeah, you're right.
You know, but
We're sitting at 3 times that night now, right?
so.
I just want to say, I think that it's important to remember that we really do want a fiscally stable school, but the schools have to realize that a fiscally unstable town is a disaster for the schools as well. So if we don't have the money and we can't raise it, there's no choice. I mean, we run out of choices. And I think that's where we're heading, especially if these sped costs and the additional assessments are, as you said, pretty much out of your control. They're not going to go away next year. So we're going to look at then a 3% increase next year on top of this 5% increase. You're going to bankrupt us. So, and I know, you know, in Lancaster, we've cut, and we've cut. And, you know, those years that we had 3% assessment increases for the schools, we didn't increase our other budgets at all. So nobody got anything else. The schools got everything we had. So to say, you know, we now have, you know, we have a police department that's depleted. You know, we've got building projects that, existing buildings that need roofs desperately because they're leaking. And it's just, we're up against a wall. And very little new growth is expected over the next 8 months. So, and as Ryan said, our hope is new growth, is economic development, but it's not going to happen next year, and it's not going to happen the year after that. And we're going to have to spend to get there.
And just to complete the thought I should have completed before, as I said at the advisory committee meeting, the FY16 deficit right now projected is $517,000, and that does not include any COLAs for our town employees yet. We do have a plug number for that. And it doesn't include any capital. But as I said at that meeting, using the same growth rates, actually slightly less growth rates for the district than what we're looking at this year as far as spending goes, the $517,000 plus deficit in FY16 and FY20 becomes 1.3 million. So status quo gets us out of business pretty quickly.
I think one of the things too is, you know, with Lancaster, you're seeing a lot of tax delinquencies, and you're looking at seizing, you know, kicking people out of their houses.
Well, it's also, I mean, as a purely monetary thing, it's about $400,000 or $480,000 in tax revenue we aren't receiving because people can't pay it. So that has a...
And the thing is, you know, it turns into a downward cycle that then all of a sudden people are moving out of the neighborhoods because the houses are next door are falling into disrepair. You can't rent them. The property valuations plummet, and nobody wants to move in. So there goes your economic development because nobody wants to live there. You know, I think we're in a better place in Stowe right now. We're not bouncing up against some of the limits, but part of it is because we've been controlling our expenditures. You know, we keep them down. We don't want to go anywhere near the levy limit. And you know what? Yeah, we've got some free cash, but it's one-time money. And we spend it down every year too, rather than raising the tax rate.
Taking 250,000 to buy, to knock the top off that, the fire station project.
Right.
And we also put, this is going to cross over into the next item, I guess, but we're also making a start at funding our OPEB liabilities, which I think is going to be an issue we're going to need to discuss shortly, too.
Randy?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to echo Don's comments, right? I think, if I'm not mistaken, the $517,000 deficit right now that the town has currently includes raising the levy limit in the next fiscal.
It anticipates.
That's correct.
Right, and so the point on levy capacity with, the advisory committee and others, I think, have abandoned leaving levy capacity on the table this year like we have been able to in the past few years, and we're still $500,000 in the red with this $830,000 assessment. So to Jennifer's point, we're up against the wall too, from what I've seen.
And as far as economic development goes in Bolton, I mean, we don't have a heck of a lot of opportunity for economic development. Roughly 95% of all of our tax revenue comes from residential. And we have focused on largely trying to repopulate buildings that already exist and not have new economic development. And that's been a mixed blessing. We did get a tenant for the future electronics building on 117, and a great corporate neighbor in Paragon who employs 200 people. But aside from that, we have little to no opportunity for that.
All right, we've covered a lot of our what was to have been our first topic, budget, but there's the second sub-item under the budget was school committee request reductions to FY16 budget, and I guess we had a question that sort of alluded to that, but where does that?
So I'm working on those now.
Yeah.
That's my daily routine for the last 7 days. There was a range down around, somebody mentioned 3%. So I'm trying to build an adjustment to the budget with both revenues and expenses. But it's been said several times, our budget, like yours, is 8% personnel. It's very hard to get to roughly $1 million without impacts on personnel. And it's about choosing the right personnel to make sure that we're not impacting goals, capacity to move forward, innovation, things that the school department has asked of me to make sure happen in the district. So those will be on the table on Wednesday.
And what's the schedule? When's school committee going to be hearing your options?
March 11th.
Now, is that, I know at the last school committee meeting, it was discussed that March 11th is the date that you have to vote. So, and I said, take your time. But obviously, if you're going to be presenting something on the 11th, the school committee may not necessarily be in a position to make a decision on whatever options you're presenting that evening. So, I mean, I'm not going to speak for the rest of the selectmen or the other towns, but, I would think that, some deliberation and review of what you're presenting probably would be the prudent thing to do. And perhaps at the subsequent school committee meeting, they could either vote or not vote. But I think, you presenting something on a night that, in theory, you're supposed to vote up or down the budget, or whatever permutation of it, might be a little aggressive. So I don't know how, I know we have one or two school committee reps.
We talked about only having a vote if we were able to see it prior to the 11th. So I think that stands. If we find out what those reductions are prior to the 11th, perhaps we could still have the vote on the 11th, but if we don't hear about it for the first time until the 11th, we will not be voting that night.
Well, I mean, you still have to have a discussion, so I mean, even if you see it
we'll
before the
discuss
11th.
it. Absolutely.
Before the 11th, you can't discuss it as a school committee because it's violation of open meeting law. So you would, the first time you'd be able to discuss it would be on the 11th.
Correct.
As a committee.
Correct.
But if you had some figures in advance, you could prep for the
Exactly.
meeting and still take action then.
Well, And we would have to take a poll that night to
Right.
see if people had had enough time with the numbers.
Right.
So I can't promise you whether or not the vote will be that night or not.
This is not different than our usual procedure, we have right up to the wire.
Mr. Superintendent, would those recommendations that you're going to give to the school committee be able to be CC'd to town administrators or finance directors so that we can start to plan for what any of those scenarios would be?
Well, it'd be part of their packet, so it's public information,
Okay.
sure, absolutely.
Because, I mean, earlier, there was an interesting photo that went viral on the internet. It showed a weasel riding on the back of a hummingbird, or a bird, a woodpecker while it was flying. I don't know which one of us is the weasel and which one of us is the woodpecker, but we're both taking the same trip.
I think I'd like another option, but. Can I ask Brad, what's your deadline for when you need a figure to close out your budget planning?
I don't have a date in mind. I'm missing that date.
Statute is April 30th.
I'm sorry?
The statute is April 30th.
No, I'm saying, our warrant goes to press
Yeah.
April 3rd. So we have to have we have to have our budget done no later, I would think, than the last week of March. And there's a lot that goes into that. So I didn't know if the school committee didn't vote on March 11th, if Bolton would need a vote by March 18th for you to be prepared as opposed to, say, March 25th.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the sooner the better, but, you know, we will find a way to make it happen to get that to press.
Well, the other
But
way,
yeah, right, there's still a lot that we do need to do.
the other way you could do it is plug in the current budget in there and then just move on town meeting floor would be move a lower appropriation
We could.
once they cut it.
We can
Assuming.
always
Gotta
balance
balance the
it
budget.
too.
Yeah,
The existing assessment.
Publicly
You'd have to change everything.
posted.
Right, we have to
Or
make
we can run
assumptions.
scenarios based on
Right.
those tiers, kind of to your point. Which would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks.
I tell you what, in my experience, the margins are so razor thin to pay for any of it that it's difficult to put in the higher number and hope for another number, because what ends up happening is you lose the economic benefit. If that money gets motioned on town meeting floor as a lower number, you've lost the economic benefit in this fiscal year of the money that you saved, unless you can quickly reapportion it to something else. Hard decisions need to be made between now and the time that the warrant goes to print, and I think, from what I've seen, the margins are so thin that you need a number by the middle of the month to be able to have any hope of trying to work within the confines of the budget.
Well, one of the things I would, I was going to bring it up later, but I suppose this would be the group and the place to talk about, would we all try to get together on something like this? What would be a number that we could all live with, as well as the school district? We'd like to find out where they could stand, and my preference would be that the school district would give us a number that we could all support, but if they don't, what's the next step? Do we propose our own number and apportion it across the 3 towns and come up with an alternate so that the school district can at least move on? They don't have to accept it, but they have the option to accept it.
Isn't that what town meeting's for?
That's what I'm talking about. Maybe the Board of Selectmen would go in and, instead of proposing the school district's budget, we would recommend against that, and we would recommend for a 3% budget. And
We've done this.
Been there.
I can tell.
Been there, done
We've
that.
done that.
Well, the difference is now, I think all 3 towns are concerned
the
enough
same.
about this that I think if we have FinCom and selectmen from all 3 towns saying that the number we can support, the percentage is X, or the assessment number, I think that's going to carry some weight with the school committee members. They're going to have to pay attention to that.
Like I said, my preference would be that the school committee would propose a number that we could support. That's always been my preference, but
Makes life easier on town meeting floor.
it makes my life much easier, because it's not contentious, The school district doesn't get what they want, we don't get a number as low as we'd like, but we meet somewhere in the middle, and we have to move on.
Don,
Mike?
how does that work? I mean, are we in a position where we as a town can, or three towns can say, we don't want X, we want Y? Or is it the position that either we accept or reject the number?
Well, I'll let Michael answer first, and then I'll comment
The
on that.
statute requires that only the school committee of a regional school district put a number before the town meeting. So that methodology would just require us to have another town meeting, which I really would want to avoid if at all possible. I think there's a lot of work that we can do and get to a number by March 11th.
Just to reinforce what Michael's saying, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the school department brings a budget number forward to town meeting. The number is either accepted or rejected.
Right.
If it's rejected, then the school committee, I believe, has 30 days to come up with a new number, or not a new number, has 30 days to come back. Could come back with the same number or a different number. And then we go through the whole iterative process again. And then if a number isn't finally voted on by the district, I think by July 1st, then I think it's the Department of Education that tells us what our number will be.
Yep.
I
And
believe it's
we
level
no longer
funded.
get a vote in it.
I believe it's a level fund, that they're level funded until the new number comes out.
It
Yes,
isn't level
until-
funded, but
right, until a new
it's
number comes
not-
up.
It's not the budget we present and.
It's last year's
Right.
budget.
Right.
So.
Right.
And that really is the nuclear option. I don't think that's where anybody wants
Right,
to
no, but the other thing is, we proposed this a number of years ago, it didn't work. But one of the other options is, and let's say we pick a 3% number. You end up putting that 3% number, right? You work out the assessments with the school district. You propose that number on town meeting floor. But because Bolton, Stowe, and Lancaster are all, we've divvied up the increase the proper way. If you put that forward, the school district does have the option to accept it.
If it's voted in
If it's-
two out of three of the towns.
If it's voted in 2 out of the 3 towns. They have the option, they don't have to.
Right.
And in that case, it goes back exactly as you said. But what it does is it gives the school committee and the school district, as well as the towns, an option to avoid, going forward with something else. If 2 of the 3 towns accept what's been proposed by the school district, we all have to suck it up and move forward.
But were you saying that if the 3 towns decide to change the number, and we agree on what the assessments are, and we put that in our budgets, and 2 of the 3 towns vote to accept that changed number, that the school committee has to live with that?
No,
No.
they
They
can't.
can.
They can,
And then
okay.
avoid a second round of town meeting.
But it's giving them a very strong message of what
Okay.
the towns
Okay.
want, so.
Okay.
Right.
Well, it's essentially the same thing as rejecting the budget in the first
Correct.
place.
Well, rejecting the budget outright, it's just, it's
Right.
it's
It
just
forces
kind
you
of
to have another town meeting.
it's not giving them,
Well,
it's not giving them the
They can't have
guidance.
another town meeting.
Right. If we
No,
cut-
not if they accept it.
Oh, not the accept.
Right, if we cut 27 cents off the budget
Right.
that we propose,
And you just-
we've rejected it.
Right.
Right.
But,
Right.
all it does is, I like giving, providing an option to
Yeah.
avoid going back and provide a little bit of certainty,
Hmm.
and, you have the conversation up front. School district may still decide to go forward with a 5% budget. This is what we need. They make their case. But you know what? The 3 towns try to put forward a 3% budget. All right, okay, the town's spoken. And rather than, duking it out later on.
Right, well, for that option then, Don, then it would it necessarily mean that we would need to have a 3-town Board of Selectmen and Finance Committee type meeting to agree on what that number is, and then
Well,
to readjust these, if we wanted to take that option of bringing forth our own number?
well, there are options. I mean, that would be one option. Another option could be each town administrator gets with their
Yeah.
selectmen
Finance
and FinCom,
Yeah.
and each town comes up with something they can live with, and then the 3 town managers get together
Sure.
and sort something out that way. I mean,
Okay.
there are different
Rather
options.
than trying to get
And to try to get the
5,
proper
3,
number to
3
make sure
together.
it's fair.
Plus our.
I think we want to be working with the school district at that point. Make sure that the number's clean, so that, you know, the assessment, it comes out properly for all three towns. Because, you know, if you start getting it skewed, if Bolton, Stone, Lancaster, you know, 3%, 4%, and 5% budget,
Yes.
there's nothing really for them to accept.
It is it's a little premature to have that conversation. I mean, it assumes that our concerns haven't been heard and adjustments haven't been made. I think we should give the school district and the school committee the opportunity to respond, and then we figure out what we do after, because we don't know what we're reacting to yet.
Right.
And regardless, the school budget, what school committee votes on goes on our warrant.
Correct.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
we
And
will
that's
have,
what the townspeople vote on.
That's right.
we will have time to make an assessment for whether we can live with it or not, and
Yeah.
going forward after that.
Dave?
Yeah, I'd just like to elaborate on what Jennifer just said. Onto the warrant goes whatever the school committee comes up with. And to do this kind of thing you're talking about, all three towns would have to agree on what the amended amount would be, so that we'd all be putting in
But
a
hopefully we don't get
consistent
there.
message as to what the dollar amount is. But we would start out with their budget number in our
And you have to
warrant.
vote the change has to be passed, and then the budget has to be passed. It's a process. And then you gotta explain it to everybody on town meeting floor, and that's a process.
We have a new moderator, this would be a good way to break it down.
Well, let's just make it easy.
I think if that happens, that's your new moderator too.
I personally would appreciate the approach where the three towns get together and then the three towns get together with the school committee, because my other concern about this, and my previous job was in a different form of government. And it was a form of government where there were no silos between the two major portions of the budget. The mayor was the chairperson of the school committee and was able to craft that budget with the full macro view of what the rest of the city budget was. This budget here is done in silos. To break those silos down, I think would benefit all of us.
Reading a lot in the Metro West Daily News about, like Natick, I think it was one of the ones. Regular basis, because it's not a district. That's why we're grappling with all these manifestations of it. They get together and early in the year, and the town basically tells the school committee, this is what we'll support. And then there's a negotiation. Hudson does this back and forth, on Hudson High School, its school district. So they agree on a number. If the school department doesn't want to have a fight on town meeting floor, they will accommodate the selectmen and the FinCom and come up with a number that way. So I think what we're trying to do is just make it more complicated because we're disparate.
Right, and
Selectmen all
in the
over.
past, certainly the town's abilities to fund increases has been different. And, you know, Lancaster has in the past tried to lower the assessment. And as you said, 2 out of the 3 towns voted for it, so we found the money.
Different volumes here.
We cut,
Not
but,
for lack of trying.
so,
Yes.
Sure.
Bill Byron, Stowe. This is not grassroots. I'm the dirt that grows the grass. You people are gonna have to fix this and hash it out. Every time I come to one of these meetings, it seems like all we're doing is whipping the district manager here. And, but I have to say a couple of words. I have to say that school committee is the one that's going to put this budget to you. School committee did not write this budget. Mr. Wood and Mr. King wrote this budget. I don't know if the school committee knows what any of it is. I can't read this thing. Unless you let the wrote it and read it. And some of these financial guys might be able to. But when we went to a district, when we went to regionalization for all levels, the only thing we gained is an accurate curriculum that brought kids to the high school level at the same, supposedly at the same level. I haven't seen that going regionally for the whole school system has gained us much more. The other thing is that this school district is not a private corporation. They should not be accumulating money. It's I bet that every single line in this thing has a little bit of fluff in it. A little bit of fluff like the snow we got here in the last couple of weeks builds up. I'd like to know if they had any money left over in their tight budgets that they worked with over the last couple of years. And if they didn't, good. But if they did, not so good. I just don't, they're not a private entity or a public service entity. I got a feeling that being this district-wide thing, that it's not like the towns individually managing their own facilities and their own teachers and their own whatever they do for education. I just think it's become a monster. I have a feeling there's a lot of administrative costs in there that don't necessarily have to be there. Where in individual towns were running it, they wouldn't have quite so many staff, administrators floating around with pretty good salaries. I'm not sure that every teacher that is in that district teaches all day long like the teachers did when I went to school, which is before the dirt got here. And so I just think that there's you say you have to pay your teachers, you do. I'm not sure that the compensation is getting its full benefit. I just don't believe that they teach all day long. They teach class, no matter what else they do, and they teach another class. Maybe how many classes a day do the teachers normally teach?
That's it. They actually teach the work, is planned work. It's required by contract. Doing other things. Big plan.
Why don't we move on to our next agenda item, which Don had mentioned earlier, the OPEB obligations and what the district plans are on that. I know that in the town of Bolton, we are for the first time talking about funding our obligation, though it's again a tough year for that, but
Yeah, I asked this to be included on the agenda, Mr. Chairman. It's, I have a copy of what I've been told now, or shown that it is the most recent audit, December 31 of 2011. It's a hard thing for a layperson to go through 29 pages of this kind of stuff and understand it all. But the thing that jumps out at me, and Stowe, by the way, we started funding, we put in $50,000 last year, and we're going to try to take part of that free cash and lock it up and put it aside for this each year. And I think it's a start. It's not as much as, but we have a lot smaller employee base that we're planning for than the school district. But on page 9 on this, and maybe I'm being overly simplistic, I'm a simple-minded guy, so it's hard to figure this stuff out. But page 9, which is attached to the agenda, is, as I understand it, is the pay-as-you-go method. So it's not being, you haven't put away, just 1 year you put in
1 year, we started last year.
one payment. But at the budget workshop, I heard discussion that there was your proposed budget for this year, you're not budgeting anything for that line.
Correct.
What's concerning about it is in 2015, according to this chart, you have an unfunded liability of $53 million. And that grows over 30 years to $250 million by 2041. And this chart, it's kind of deceiving because you look at the numbers go down, but my understanding is that it's supposed to be updated every couple of years, so that this is based on current employees. That's why you don't have you have a very smaller number at the outer end, because those people will have been retired. But you get people who are in getting their teacher's degrees that will be coming in and filling that in. So the 30-year line will keep growing. And it's up 24% since the audit was done. In the first year, it was projected then to be 42 million, now it's 53. That's a 24% increase in that length of time. And I guess I just asked the question of you and particularly address it to the school committee members. How is that being responsible financially for the future of the district not to even address this? I'm arguing against what we've just been talking about here, because I'm saying we need to put more money into this. So I'm not saying where it's going to come from, but let's take this as a separate item. Is this financial management, good, prudent financial management to ignore this?
As with anything, this is a guide. It is not law, it's not statute. It's an accountant's recommendation from the group of accountants. So it's like they created work for themselves and made this a possibility of what the Gatsby numbers are like. In better times, I think we will have a different perspective on being able to fund it. But it's such a large nut to crack. It's a drop in the bucket to be able to put $150,000 of assessed money into it, which you don't have. And I would rather, and I think we'll see by the vote of the school committee, my recommendation is I would rather have 3 teachers rather than put it into OPEB.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just like to also, just on that comment, we all have underfunded pension and OPEB obligations, every single town, every school district, right? So, listen, this is a big nut to crack. I think Bolton's is what, $4 million, something like that?
A little over 2.
2, all right. So, I mean, Stowe, Lancaster have the same thing. I mean, we all try to be prudent financial planners and practice prudent financial principles, but those are big nuts to crack for towns too. So I just want to point that out, right? It's not, I'm an equal opportunity arguer.
As a citizen of Stowe, I'll argue against it.
Yeah, I have to support that sentiment. I mean, I don't discount post-employment benefits as it's not a liability. It is absolutely a liability, but it's a liability where the nightmare scenario isn't exactly quantifiable. My previous job had a $200 million underfunded OPEB liability. Worcester's is $700 million. Some of these numbers are absolutely insurmountable. It is not possible that they will ever be able to get to it. So, yeah, I guess I would have to agree with the superintendent and the gentleman behind him on that one.
Town of Wayland, another news clipping, their number is $79 million, they're looking way out, but they already have 12 million toward their obligations. Even if it's a token to recognize that it is a problem, and that's what our 50,000 I think is in Stowe. But
So Lancaster has 2.4 million is our liability,
It's close to that, yeah.
and we have 462,000 that we put aside.
you're way ahead of the rest of us then.
I think we were planning, we had some one-time capital in our, we sold a cell tower, there was another, we plan to put that towards our OPEB liability. I'm hoping, because the problem is that the longer you put it off, as this table shows, the bigger it gets, and it happens quickly.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, if you catch it early, as Jennifer said, and Lancaster has done, and put a substantial amount of money, I mean, it went from, we reduced it by 1/3 in 1 year. And that allows, a couple of years of token, and then, you try to hit it big again, and you stay on top of it. But out of the 351 cities and towns and the other entities that incur these type of liabilities, for the most part, many have let them get to the insurmountable level. So like I said, I mean, exactly what's gonna happen down the road when some of these chickens come home to roost is, I don't think yet easy to quantify.
I suppose one of the things I wanted to say, I kind of agree that we've got some problems that are gonna come home to roost at some point. But also the comment that Superintendent Wood just made, he'd rather have 3 teachers than $150,000 going into OPEB. Well, guess what? Those 3 teachers are gonna just increase that OPEB. So you know what? Maybe we need to cut out the 3 teachers, or not hire them, and that'll reduce our OPEB going forward, even if we can't put cash into it. But I think, it goes back to what I was saying before, we've got to control the expense side. Once we get that under control, maybe we can, put some money in there.
John?
For anyone from Bolton that hasn't already heard these numbers, our total exposure for OPEB right now, forget the unfunding balance, right now we've got $308,000 that we haven't, that we should or could have, however you want to choose to put in, and we haven't. This year's ARC is $186,000, and the plug number that we put in to the budget right now is $186,000 to start dealing with that ARC. That was a number that a subcommittee came up with. It was also prior to seeing the current proposed school budget. So whether we fall back on that or not somewhat, remains to be seen, but we are trying for the first year to get something started in there, because even if it is a token to start off, I think every year is hard, and at some point you have to start. Because I think it's wishful thinking to think that this is a nut, that this is a chicken that isn't gonna come home to roost, and it's just a matter of how long we wait before we start dealing with it.
And to further that point, I mean, the town treasurer has also indicated that, the state's gonna be looking at this at some point in the not too distant future. And for those towns who are not making even a token gesture of funding it and making at least a consistent token gesture of funding it, there are implications in the credit rating of the town being in jeopardy. Now, at one standpoint, if we go from a little bit less in terms of credit rating, that won't necessarily affect to a great extent, whether we borrow money and what percentage rate we get, but it has a big effect on the perception of the credit rating of the town going down, and also the perceived value of the town valuation and everything else. So there is an implication here. And I think, to dismiss this, I think is a mistake. And I think, we are seriously trying to figure out some way to be able to start to deal with this particular issue, even if it's only in a modest way.
So I'm looking at the Neshoba Regional District Management Letter dated June 30th, 2013, which is a little old. However, it's the recommendation, and this comes from your auditor, I think pretty much every year, is to recommend that management be prepared to study and evaluate these changes for financial statement reporting and disclosure purposes, to formulate plans, to meet with your actuaries and financial advisors as more information becomes available. You might want to consider how and when this information should be communicated to your member communities and other financial statement users. And I'm wondering if there's been any subcommittee formed, any organized effort to try to just simply wrap some numbers and some logic around it for the district.
We conduct our audit every 2 years for the OPEB. Okay. And the finance committee does review that. The school committee completely reviews that.
So has any subcommittee been formed to look at OPEB specifically?
Not specifically.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, anything else on OPEB? All right, any other items? Anyone? Very good, all right.
Well, actually, I think, Jen sort of talked around it, but I think in this whole thing where we have this shared responsibility, I think the option of trying to present to any of the three towns, the option of going with an override is probably not an option that the townspeople will even be willing to entertain this year. So I think that's something that is probably completely off the table. So, you know, we have our levy limit capacity, we have our free cash capacity, and that's all we have to play with. You know, the town has some things that it needs, the various towns have things that they need to purchase, so some of that free cash has to go to that as opposed to all to the town, so I think overrides are off the table this year. That's just my...
I don't think they'd vote for it. We could try.
We could try, but I don't think
it would
I
work.
agree with that, I don't think they'd vote for it.
I agree. Nothing to do there.
Well, if that's the case, and the budget's more than you can handle, you're gonna be making cuts somewhere else. That's all.
Right.
Right? It's gotta come from somewhere.
We can't run deficits.
Just know it.
Yeah.
So hopefully either on or
We
before...
can do that very well.
Right, so either on or before the next school committee meeting, we may have the availability of a packet of suggested cuts. And when is the next school committee meeting?
March 11th.
The 11th.
We can take.
Could you just get that to the three town administrators and they can take care of getting it to the rest of us that are interested?
You're having a public hearing that night too, right?
Yes.
Yes.
That's required by the district agreement.
Well, great.
So
Well,
I
thanks.
move that we adjourn.
Another meeting?
Yeah.
Do we have another meeting?
Oh.
Oh, the next,
That would be Stowe.
Stowe.
Still, what works for you folks?
we say the,
April?
The 12th?
Or do we want to wait till after and we'll just have a debriefing?
Well, I guess that is the question. Do we want to try to meet again in March? Or does it not really?
we could tentatively set
Well,
April
I
Fool's meeting.
think the point was made that the school committee's gonna put in whatever budget
Whatever they want.
And then it's up
Whatever
to
they
the town leaders to decide whether we support that or whether we want to provide an alternate number in town meeting.
Yeah, so you're,
So there's not as much of a rush.
Yeah.
April 1st in Stowe then?
Yeah.
April 1st in Stowe?
April what?
First, April
How
Fool's
appropriate
Day.
is that? I believe that's clear, but I'll have to check it with schedules for meetings, and I'll put out a notice on that. Mr. Burke?
Yes.
April 1st, they're proposing for hosting in Stowe.
Oh,
This next meeting is
well,
April.
if I'm chair, then April 1st is probably the... Did I miss the cheese and crackers we got?
No, there's cookies up there.
Cookies and jelly beans.
Cider.
So now I move we adjourn.
I'll second that.
Yes. All those in favor?
Because we don't want, it's just not civil.
All right.